Hi, I'm Ed Joffe, and welcome to JoffeWoodwinds.com. Today we're going to start a series of interviews with renowned woodwind artists from this country who have played a vital part in the music industry for many decades. Our first guest today is an old friend of mine who I've known for just about 40 years now. I've had the pleasure of working with him and collaborating with him and sharing a great deal of insight into the music and music industry. Lawrence Feldman has been a mainstay of the New York recording scene now since the 1970s, and Lawrence has had an amazing career playing in virtually every musical situation one could imagine, from jazz ensembles like Bob Mintz's band and the National Jazz Ensemble, TV bands like the Saturday Night Live Band, working with orchestras, the New York Philharmonic, American Ballet Theatre, Concordia, working, touring, and recording with singers like Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand, Liza Minnelli, Tony Bennett, Audra McDonald. He's recorded for jazz artists, commercial artists, classical artists, people such as Steely Dan, Eliana Elias, John Scofield, Dave Sanborn, Michael Franks, James Moody, Frankie Valli, Rod Stewart. You've heard him featured on TV shows, soundtracks such as Square One and All My Children, movie soundtracks. He's done many Broadway shows, I think 15 or more since counting, jingles. Anyway, it's our pleasure today to welcome one of the truly inspiring musicians in woodwind doubling in the world today. This is Lawrence Feldman. Lawrence, thanks so much for coming here. And
thanks, Ed.
You're going to share your time and your experience and knowledge so that hopefully we can illuminate some of the problems in woodwind doubling and some of the great things about being a multiple woodwind instrumentalist with some of the younger folks who are looking at the site. And when did you actually start lessons seriously? I know Jerry Goldstein was an early teacher of yours who was very inspirational and influential.
Yes.
So, and that's when you started getting, from what I remember, our discussions, getting more serious about music.
Well, more serious in that I became aware of what a higher level of playing was. Until that teacher, I didn't have any what you'd call proper teacher. I had like gigging guys that someone told my parents, someone in a music store said, "Oh, this guy, was very very casual." Right. They were more like club day guys, as we call them in New York, and the West Coast casuals. And I really didn't know about the existence of. I had heard a little bit about teachers and practicing symphony music, but I was very, very green, to be honest. Right. And I didn't, at that point, did not have any thought of doing it as a profession.
Right. So when did the bug happen?
Well, the bug happened with Stan Getz.
Right.
All the way on. I just wanted to do it for my own fun, and I was very motivated, or maybe enough to play with people. I think my father put in my head the idea that it would be a way to make money on the weekends to help me make money in college, which ended up happening, by the way, working in the Catskills on weekends and even summers.
But that's interesting.
Jerry Goldstein, my first good teacher. That didn't happen until after I was in college, and I was not a music major. And I heard some guy in the orchestra, which I wasn't in. I went to listen, who sounded fantastic, and I had decided to maybe become a music major at Brooklyn College. And I said, "What about this teacher here, Ernest McLean?" And he said, "Well, he's okay, but there's this my teacher is this guy, Jerry Goldstein, who I found out later was a retired member of the Pittsburgh Symphony and happened to be a great teacher. I would still say one of my best teachers, even though I went on to study with a lot of famous teachers. I would rate him among the best. He was just a low-key guy who ended up teaching in the high schools, but he was that, and that was when I first got, wow, the clarinet can sound this beautiful and refined,
Right. So was the clarinet really was the first of the woodwinds that you studied, let's say, in a more stereotypical, classical, formal fashion?
Definitely.
Right.
Saxophone, I had teachers, just kind of push me through the Salviani book or Pasquale Bona, which was a great book, by the way, for learning rhythms.
Right.
And the Close daily saxophone study. But the level that I did it at, I realized later after having good teachers, was very what I would call homemade.
Right. Interesting.
Now Goldstein started, this is the first time Eugene Gay method, practice slowly, practice scales this way, move the fingers. It was all new to me.
Right.
And it was fantastic. I used to love going to his basement and hearing him play. It was an amazing experience.
Right. Well, studying with someone or being around someone who's a great player is a constant turn on, whether you're studying with them or working with them on a gig or something. So even at a young age, when you're surrounded, I think, by great playing, that's maybe the greatest motivation there is. And that, I think, for both of us, that probably continues to this day. To be that.
After the Stan Getz moment and other moments, that was one of the major shocks in a good way of my life, opening up a lot of excitement that, wow, it could be so beautiful, the clarinet.
Right. And now, when did the saxophone
Saxophone had started before that. Oh.
No, but get to that level of seriousness.
Well, that exact level, I would say almost never, because I never studied classical saxophone really at all. But in my own way, once I started hearing guys better than me, which is in the Catskill Mountains when I was in college, I seriously started practicing kind of what I figured out, and it mostly became oriented to jazz because I had got infatuated with Charlie Parker and other people. In fact, I remember my last year of high school, first time I heard Charlie Parker, which luckily was Just Friends with Strings, and I knew the song in my mind so I could appreciate what. And I went to the band teacher in my last year of high school and I said, Mr. Levine, why didn't you ever mention to me about Charlie Parker? And also, I never even heard the name. Why isn't it in the papers every day? I mean, that's why I said, why isn't it in the newspapers? I never even heard of him, because he wasn't as popular at the time as, he wasn't current.
Right.
I ended high school in '66. So I started practicing just because I liked it, I kind of figured out my own ways of transcribing little licks and practicing them, and a few other things happened which I'm not mentioning.
Right. But now looking back on it, are
Yes.
you glad that you started, or the clarinet was the first woodwind instrument that you began on a more serious basis? Do you feel that was a benefit in transferring to saxophone a few years later? Do you think, and would you recommend that approach if one were looking to become a doubler, that if you had the option, clarinet would precede any of the other woodwinds, or at least precede saxophone?
Yes, it's considered common knowledge. The common consensus is starting on clarinet is the best, because in a way it's the hardest. And yes, looking back, that was great. Yeah.
So now you're in college. You're playing clarinet and saxophone. You're doing gigs in upstate New York and the Catskill Mountains, which was for many people who weren't around at that time a place that had many hotels and bungalow colonies and really served as sort of a training ground. You might say a minor league for young musicians to gain experience in playing dance music, in reading music for shows, and just living as a full-time musician, whether it be during the summers or on weekends during the year, something that no longer exists, unfortunately, and has made it harder for young musicians, especially woodwind doublers, to gain that insight and training ground so necessary to perhaps survive in any level of music industry. So again, getting back, you're now in college, you're gigging. Are you now set on becoming a professional musician? What actually turned you onto that career choice?
It was more like, okay, I think in my last year of high school I played some sort of prom, and this was with, knowing maybe 10 songs and some local kids who lived in my neighborhood, and it was a lot of fun just playing like cha-chas and whatever, luai, whatever was around at the time. And I sort of did have the thought like, holy mackerel, if I could actually make a job out of this, wow, but I didn't think it was possible because I started so late. I didn't go to music high school or music college. But that's the idea, is that it wasn't like I made a plan, I'm going to become a musician, but I kind of thought, wow, if that could happen, how great, like escape drudgery, and it seems like so much fun.
Right.
You know.
Right. Well, I think that's also a key, that for music to become a career for someone and a career choice, at the outset, before it even begins, music has to be fun. It has to be something, I think, that you just want to do all the time. Just like a kid who's gifted in athletics, they just dream of playing in the NBA or the NFL or Major Leagues baseball. But same thing, I think, for us, that it was so much fun that the idea of having a career doing something that's this much fun seems like, well, how can you not want to do that then?
Something like that,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
very much.
Yeah. But I know from our discussions and the fact that we all had a great admiration for Eddie Daniels and how influential he was.
Oh, that's a good story, yeah.
In both of our careers, and just the idea that one can be that accomplished, that good on everything, meaning all the saxophones, clarinets, flutes, and so committed and passionate about it. I know it had a great effect on me, and I know it also had a great effect on you. Can you maybe give a little background to Eddie's influence on you?
Okay. By chance, by the way, I should say this now. My personal observation in life is that what happens in a person's life, and also very much career, is often influenced heavily by a series of coincidences. Might be too light a word, but almost random, or maybe, if you believe in another system of life, fatalistic things that you have no control over. Just some odd event happens, like my friend's mother happening to have desafinado. But anyway, with Eddie Daniels, when I was still, I was under 17, and I happened to turn on the radio at a certain moment, Billy Taylor's jazz show, and I think the first thing I heard was That Waltz, the clarinet, the cut, That Waltz. So the record had just come out, apparently. I never heard of Eddie Daniels.
This was the record first prize.
The record first prize, sorry. Right. And then within 2 minutes, there's Eddie Daniels talking to, because it turned out it was an interview of Billy Taylor, and talking about that he had won this prize, jazz competition in Vienna. And we're going to play Eddie's new record and talk to us. So I heard Eddie talking. He sounded like a regular Brooklyn guy, which he is. And it was very enamoring and puzzling to me how a guy that sounded so regular in his talking could be that accomplished. It was unbelievable. But anyway, fast forward to college, and I think in my fourth year of college, Brooklyn College, that is, a regular city college, they started to try to have a jazz department. And along with that, they said, so now we recognize jazz, as opposed to, I used to get stopped from practicing jazz in the basement. Who would you like to take lessons with? We're going to pay for it. So I came up with this idea, wow, let me think for a while. And then I thought either George Coleman or Eddie Daniels. And I went into the chairman of the department. I said either Eddie Daniels or George Coleman. That would be my two favorite guys that I would like to learn from. And the chairman says, well, Eddie Daniels is a graduate of Brooklyn College. And I said, he is? And they said, so let's go with Eddie Daniels. and I said, either one would be fantastic. So then I studied with Eddie Daniels for a while. It was really well under a year. It was paid for by Brooklyn College, and that's how that happened.
And you maintained the friendship with Eddie to this day. It's a long time. You're great friends, and
right.
He's been a great influence and inspiration for both of us.
Right.
As your career has progressed, can you talk about some of the other musicians who have been a great inspiration, and
sure.
and maybe some that maybe people aren't as familiar with?
True. That could be a whole interview, because that's who I learned probably the most from. In addition to some extremely accomplished guys in the Catskills when I was still a teenager or 20 years old, who were older than me, who were almost world-class jazz players, and one or two guys even could have been good enough to be studio doublers. But they probably had life problems, or they couldn't face the pressures of the New York scene, so they chose to remain kind of anonymously, 100 miles away from New York. But yes, okay, here's kind of what happened. So I went from the Catskills to not so much the Catskills, doing casuals in New York, and then also doing free rehearsal bands, which are called kicks bands or whatever. And there were a lot of great musicians, much more established than me, working guys who did some of these kicks bands, such as George Young and maybe Lou Soloff, Alan Rubin, all sorts of established guys. And I do remember one time playing in a rehearsal band with George Young and Salnistica, and wow. How I even got into that, first of all, I don't know, but that's a whole subject, which was, in those days, the established working guys, there was so much work that they could actually get away with having to be late for a recording session or having to leave early, and it would actually be acceptable to the conductor or composer, because they felt, well, if I want, Randy Brecker or George Young or Lou Marini or Eddie Daniels, they're busy and I can't expect them to always do it. So there was a need for guys like myself to sometimes be sent in to do the part of a gig that they couldn't do. Okay. In today's climate of how the business is now, which is, in a nutshell, way more formal and businesslike than it was then, it's hard to imagine there was a time when someone could say to the contractor or conductor or composer, like, hey, I have this problem. Could I just do the first hour of the record date and then split, because I promised I'm going to do a solo for Quincy Jones, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And they could do it then. It's hard to believe, but that's what the scene was. So one thing that happened was, playing in these rehearsal bands, just one example that I remember was playing next to George Young, and excuse me. And
it's time for the medication.
It's time for meditation, really. That's what I believe. I remember playing next to George Young, and he was very nice, and he liked the way I played second alto to him, or whatever, or maybe I had a solo, I really don't remember. And within 6 months of that, he had that situation I described where he couldn't do part of a gig, and he asked me if I could do it, and then I did it, and that was sort of how I started breaking into the studio scene, right. Something like that. In addition, just dumb luck. The first record date I ever did was composed by a guy I don't know who, first jingle, excuse me, and he was friends with a trumpet player who I worked with in the Catskills, and the trumpet player was asked, who do you think should play saxophone? And he go, oh, I love Lawrence Feldman, we worked together. Another random thing, I believe, so. Anyway.
But that's an important point to make,
yes.
To everyone, that no matter how much you set yourself up, as you said earlier, for a prescribed course of action, maybe in today's world going to school, majoring in music,
yes.
majoring in jazz, majoring perhaps even in woodwind doubling at some schools, studying with certain players maybe who are connected or working,
yep.
that nothing can replace the random aspect of life that you never know who you're going to meet that is going to be able to provide or open a door for you,
yep.
An opportunity for you. You can't predict that, and the harder you try to make something like that happen, often it backfires. So that perhaps what you're saying, and a little bit, that we've talked about this over the years, that just the commitment to playing and learning and being open to all types of music and all types of situations, doing a rehearsal band that doesn't pay, but hey, it may be fun music, and I may meet some people,
great music,
and you would meet other players and develop friendships. All of these things go into developing a career, not just for a specific gig, but a career of 40 plus years.
Right.
And that's something that everyone should take advantage of, not boo-hoo something that doesn't pay or doesn't pay as well, that, you have to just be open to doing everything and anything.
Definitely, but a little earlier in what you just said, looking back on my not self-made career path. I would really say it was a series of things, one thing led to another. That's how I would summarize in my case. Number one, I don't think that's too likely to happen in today's climate because there just is a lot less work, partly because of synthesizers replacing a lot of live people, partly for other reasons, devaluation of money, of the arts, devaluation of appreciation of the art. But the first thing I want to say is you said about if you try too hard. From a very young age, I was very attracted to philosophical things and later Eastern and Zen. I'm talking about even when I was 19. And looking back, I didn't really think I applied those principles, but looking back, I kind of did. And I'll give you one example. Was at some point, I was doing a Broadway show, and this is when I was 29 or 30, and it was a matinee day, Saturday, and at 12 o'clock, I got a call from someone. It might have been Tom Malone or David Spinoza. Hey, Lawrence. I was already a little bit known. I was definitely known by them. Hey, Lawrence, by any chance, are you available to come right down now to the Saturday Night Live NBC Studio 8H? Because it was actually, Sanborn didn't show up, and could you come down? Now, I had to do a matinee that day, too, and I said, I really think so, but give me a minute to work on it. And of course, I hung up. I said, shit, this is like, wow, this is something. At the same time, I realized that it was very possible I couldn't get someone that quickly. And I was already sort of able to not freak out and let go of it, that if it happened that I couldn't get anyone, so what? I'm not going to die, and maybe it's not meant to. So I called a few subs. No one answered the phone. I reached Aaron Sachs, and this is a funny story. You could edit this out if you want, but I have to tell you. And Aaron goes, yeah, I think I could do it, but I promised Phyllis I'm going to take her shopping. And I said, wow, Aaron, this one is really important. If you could do it, it would be such a great favor. But you don't have to. If it's going to hurt your marriage, I remember saying that. You don't have to. And he said, let me talk to Phyllis and call you back. So he called me back. It's now 20. He said, I just can't. Phyllis is too disappointed. So I had to call back the NBC people and say, I'm really sorry, but I can't get out of something. I'm busy until 5 o'clock. And it was just like, oh, too bad. Well, thanks anyway. It was that casual. And I wasn't freaked out. That's where the acceptance part of these books maybe helped me. I didn't completely freak out and go, oh no, I missed this great opportunity. I really didn't. I said, it must be the way it's meant to be. And looking back in my career, I think that helped a little bit. And the Saturday Night Live story goes on, but
you eventually did play the Saturday Night Live band.
I guess that's the point.
Right.
Even though I missed that chance, and I found out later they had been using other tenor players. But I'm saying this philosophy can help of taking things in perspective and not. And well, you know what it is? It's a letting go of feeling you can control everything.
Right.
It's taking to a letting go, which leads to possibly a more relaxed demeanor on the gigs because you're not always thinking, oh, if I do good here, then this and that, and
right.
I think that's helped me a lot.
Right, and every gig is unto itself, and there's no commitment beyond that. I mean, there has to be. I think for someone, especially today, even more so than when we started to break into the music industry, because there's so much less work and the stakes are higher for every gig that you do, that carrying this type of anticipation of what if I do this gig, what will it lead to here, and trying to look ahead into the future, sort of
Right.
forecast the future, it is not a positive way of going about preparing.
Well, it might be for
survive.
some people. Another belief I have is that every person's mind, body, how they should practice, outlook on life is different. I now respect that more, that what's good for one person isn't good for another in every part of life. Sleep, diet, music, career path, personality. I really believe that. In my case, I think that ended up being okay for me. If I can digress, I left out one thing about how did I get into wanting to be a better doubler. Another random thing, which was, well, the first part wasn't random. The first part was on these Catskill gigs, as you know, in the lead alto books, which I began playing in my young 20s in the house bands, which maybe had, there'd be these really nice flute solos and sometimes clarinet solos. And I played them okay. I was a little homemade on the flute. And I thought wow, it'd be so great if I could sound like what I've heard great flute players sound like. So then I got motivated. The next summer, also by chance, it's a whole story, but I'll leave it out, random happening, I ended up working in a band with Ray Ricker, who was older than me. Ray Ricker, if you don't know, became the head of, woodwinds at Eastman.
Eastman, now he's a dean there, I think.
I heard he retired.
But
anyway,
recently
this
too.
was a young Ray Ricker who was moonlighting from being in the Army at the West Point Band, and he's playing next to me. In fact, it was quite humorous because he wasn't technically allowed to be working at night and be in the West Point. So him and he actually wore like a Beatles wig, and I thought he really looked like that. I don't think Ray would mind me saying that. But anyway, here was a guy who was way more advanced than me as a doubler. And he said, oh, you should study with Bennett or Al Regni or this or that guy. And I heard a level of better flute and clarinet playing, and I got very inspired. In fact, I took one flute lesson from him that summer. So that was where the idea to be a better doubler, again, quite casual, just wanting to sound better on these written out flute parts in behind singers and magic acts and even strippers and dancers, and classical violinists. This was all what happened in the Catskills. He would sight read different acts every night. Great training ground for someone who didn't go to music college like me.
Right. Well, wouldn't you agree that maybe that was the best training ground one could have ever had? I went through a lot of schooling, as you know, and to be honest with you, I think I learned more in the Catskills on those type of jobs at hotels than I did in all the years with all the degrees that I got at any school, honest to God.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think I believe that, but I don't know exactly what goes on in the music colleges. I do. The good part about it, I think, is getting a chance to play great ensemble music of different kinds, which I did through Lynn Oliver's studios. And when you played a book in the Catskills for Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, or who else was up there?
Well, Mel Torme,
Jack
Jones.
That was almost like playing Streisand or Sinatra level arrangements, except that the quality of playing it wasn't quite as high, but it was pretty high. They'd bring in extra guys. So yes, in my case, the Catskills was sort of a music education that I didn't have academically. And the great thing was you had to fake things by ear to play dance music, and then you had to read all sorts of Vidians on all sorts of copy, and it could be from a classical opera singer from Hungary with a part that you could barely read, to like Mel Torme or someone like that, and that was a great training ground.
Right. And it's interesting because it seems to, from your experience, that what led you to some of the great teachers that you studied with, in addition to Eddie Daniels, I know you studied with Leon Rushinoff and Joe Allard, Harold Bennett. What led you to a lot of these great teachers was the actual on-the-job experience where you started realizing, hey, I need to up this level. I want to up this level.
And hear guys that sounded better than me in New York, and then they'd say, oh, well, we all went to Harold Bennett, you know, and you can go to him even late at night. So I went to Harold Bennett. Rushinoff happened just by sort of accident, which was the Brooklyn College people said, well, we are acquiring, Brooklyn College is acquiring Rushinoff to teach, so we're going to send you to Rushinoff. It just sort of happened. It turned out to be very good in many ways. Bennett was after I started doing Broadway shows, or when I did. We're talking about great teachers. The audience might not know who they are. Harold Bennett was retired principal flute of the Met. Rushinoff was the teacher of Stanley Drucker and many other people. And we didn't even get to Joe Allard yet, which started the summer when I worked with Ray Ricker. Go ahead, you lead, because too many thoughts are coming up now.
Well, it's okay, but New York at that time was still the center of the recording industry. There was a huge recording industry in New York, and players were under the gun, and those were days where we didn't have Pro Tools and things weren't fixed as easily. You had to sound great right on the spot,
True.
And everything was left out in the open, the way you phrased, the way you the sound you got, the pitch you played, the articulation that you used, were you blending, and then of course the soloing aspect. So the great teachers in New York were really also there as a result of the fact that there was this community of highly skilled musicians who sought their help. And so people like Joe Allard and Leon Rushinoff could exist later on in their careers purely as teachers and literally teach 7 days a week for as many hours a day as they wanted. There was that much demand for them.
Good point.
And coincidentally, now we have a whole group of young players coming up, the baby boomer generation that we were part of, who now are inspired to play music. Music was being heard on TV and the mass media, not just pop music, but jazz music and concert music. And so there was this whole sense of music being surrounding everyone's life. And if you chose to try to enter the career of music as a professional, well, those great teachers were readily available, which are not quite the same story today.
It seems that way, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, you could go to them without going to necessarily being a member of a school. You could go to them as individuals and call them up, and they had all these hours every day of the week. And so you could go to a Joe Allard or a Leon Rushinoff or a Harold Bennett to study your doubles. And it seems to me, I may be missing, and maybe it's just age, that people were more inclined to study with these teachers in our era than I see today. That today, because every school has a variety of wonderful professionals associated with it as adjunct instructors, that the idea of just going to study with someone not connected for any degree or school is missing today to some degree. I don't see as much thirst for that type of study, and maybe that's a result of the fact that the recording industry has dissipated and you're not under the scrutiny of the microphone as much and in the way that we had to be, especially now with Pro Tools able to fix everything. Is that something that you would
that's part of it, I think. Another thing was kind of what I did, like my top teachers who were classically oriented, except Joe Allard was were that I went to them privately and paid for the lessons. It was not through school.
Right.
And I got the money to pay for the lessons from whatever gigs I was doing.
Right.
For a while I worked at the Persian Room House Band, Catskills originally. Now that idea of trying to better yourself with a classical teacher was not unique to our generation. There was a whole generation of the studio guys who were, say, 20, 30 years older than me, guys like Phil Bodner, Sid Cooper, Harvey Estrin. It's interesting. Their career path was they were on the road with big bands playing mostly jazz. The doubling needs weren't too high, except in the Sorter Finnegan band, as you know.
Right.
And then they came back to New York. If I don't want to be in the road, maybe network. Wow, you got to do. I have to play really good flute. And they went on their own. They paid and fed. Who's a good teacher? Who plays in the Met? Who will take me? And so they did the same thing. Like I was in the Catskills and wanted to sound better on flute, especially, but also everything. They did the same thing. They came off the big bands and they say, wow, I play kind of rough. I'm good for a dance band, but I've heard these guys in movies and they play real refined. And that's all those guys, Phil Bonner, Romeo Penque, Sid Cooper, they all went to...
Joe Soldo,
great example.
Right, Bernie Kaufman.
Right, and they all went to teachers like Bennett, but there's another guy before Bennett, and it's not who we said. It's not Harry Zlotnick. It's another guy. I'll think of it in a minute.
It wasn't Francis
Blaisdell?
Blaisdell?
No. I'll think. But anyway, they took it the same idea. They wanted to be better, and they sought out these private teachers, oboe teachers in the case of the guys that play. So that was done before me, except that was to have another career other than the death of the big bands was happening then.
Right.
And one other thing, I would disagree with you when you said that when I entered the scene, which was the mid-'70s, that New York was the center of recording. I think already by then,
things were
L.A. Jingles more in New York
right.
at that time. TV and movies definitely L.A. already.
Right. Yeah, you're right. But I guess I'm thinking,
but yeah, there was a lot of recording going on. That's
right,
for sure.
but I mean, like, and there was still the remnants of staff orchestras, and
yes, they had just ended.
They were just ending
right
by the mid-'70s.
Well, to summarize, when I started, there was at least 50 studios, recording studios in New York. Some were smaller, and some were quite big, and most of them were medium big. And now there's what, two?
Two.
It's
the
most
only
in Manhattan, so that speaks for itself.
Yeah, it's amazing. So here we are today in 2014, entering 2015, and there are a great many young woodwind doublers that we have all worked with and seen enter the scene, and they're in their 20s, some early 30s. What does the future hold for them from your perspective, and what can they do to ensure maybe that they have a 30, 40-year career in advance? I mean, the light may still shine on music, but it's the path that ahead of us doesn't seem to be that clear anymore. At least I don't see it that way. For that.
Yeah, I would say in that regard, probably what some other people have said, like Bob Mintzer, would be to also get into arranging and also get into, I think, arranging and maybe composition. So then you'd have to depend on steady work in a Broadway show that could be music that you can't stand, which is another whole issue, which we could do a whole interview on that.
Right.
So I guess even more diversity than being a doubler.
Right, and certainly Bob is a great example of that, and out on the West Coast as well, I would say Dan Higgins is another wonderful example of a phenomenal musician who's also a wonderful writer.
Yes.
And you know, when one is a little down, the other can be a little up. A mutual friend of ours, a pianist, wonderful jazz clarinetist and saxophonist, Tom Rainier, is another example of someone who can do
Except
both.
none of those guys you mentioned, as far as I know, ever has what in New York would be a down period. But yes, a little aside on Dan Higgins, I think he deserves a special mention because when I first met him in '94, he is I think one of a kind in terms of all the different things he can do to a level that is so high, and including arranging. And I think he even still has a library that's like for casuals that he arranged that makes a casual band sound great. Okay. And he rents that out too. So he's something else, and his ears, and I've worked with him a lot, and he's kind of, I would recommend him as someone to try to be influenced by, and it's pretty astounding. Talking as a studio musician, let's just limit it to that. Let's take legendary jazz out of the picture, even though Dan plays great jazz. But just as a studio musician, he may have reached the highest level, maybe on any instrument. I'm not sure, but wow, he is someone that's inspired me a lot as a doubler and as a lead alto player, stylist, and
right. And what's interesting is
he's an exception. I don't even think today if someone with that much abilities came up, they would probably find a way of making a living, which might include more writing than Dan has to do.
Right.
But Dan does a lot of writing.
Right. But what's interesting is hearing you speak about a colleague and someone you're still inspired by, and you've done so much yourself in music that others would look to you as an inspiration. But the point is, to be a musician that continually grows, there is no point where you can just shut off and stop. I mean, a musician, especially a woodwind doubler, having to be responsible with so many instruments, so many styles of music, and to be able to affect these changes so quickly from day to day, gig to gig, you have to be, I think, open to that type of inspiration and constantly seeking other avenues of inspiration. And I think you've done that throughout your whole life.
Yeah.
You know,
Getting the chance to play on studio sessions with guys like George Young, that's another. It might be, I could almost call it a well-kept secret in that his name isn't known as widely. He was a guy who total virtuoso, but had the ability to come up with fills that weren't necessarily even jazz. They could be like a cartoon idiom fill that would fit something. They could be humorous. They could be amazing bebop. They could be perfect funk. He played tenor solos on a lot of Chubby Checker hits in the 50s. And a guy like that, he's one of my mentors musically that was inspiring, where I realized there's more than just being jazz, because I was very focused on, when you said when I started practicing a lot, that was in my young 20s, at least till the age of 40. A lot of that was just trying to work out my own jazz ideas. And guys like George opened me up to that there's other kinds of music to excel in, even playing a polka the right way, you know, in country music, and certainly funk. Now, this brings up another point. I don't know how overtime we're going, but there's two things. As far as career path, I could just summarize, say whatever happened, happened, and I ended up a certain way. One thing I want to discuss is what has worked for me in playing different styles, and the other thing is about being a jazz purist or not. So first thing I'll talk about is the latter. When I started Brooklyn College, I think I was about 18, and still my biggest thrill was jazz. And at the time, my main instrument was tenor, and I was just tenor. I loved Lester Young, I loved Sonny Rollins, I loved Coltrane. Then I was amazed when these young white guys started playing with Elvin, which was Dave Liebman and Steve Grossman. That was an amazing thing just to see that those guys could play with Elvin and had assimilated culture. Anyway, that's what I was mostly into. But I also liked rock a lot, and at least the saxophone's role in rock, but I kind of dismissed it as well. That's simplistic. If you can play like anything at all, like Sonny Rollins or Coltrane or Stan Getz, rock is pretty simple. So anyway, in my quest for jazz, I went to a music lesson. Mike Garson, a pianist, who was a little source of information to even Richie Byrack and Grossman and Liebman. He was in that crowd, with the idea that I'm going to learn about McCoy Tyner and Bud Powell and advanced things that I could use in my jazz or bebop. Anyway, I took 2 lessons with him only, and he said, "What about your rock playing?" I said, "Yeah, I kind of like it." He said, "Let's play a rock blues." And I did, okay. I wasn't like only a jazz guy. He said, "I have an idea for you. Transcribe a solo by one of the rock guys you like." And he said, "Who are the rock guys I like?" I said, "Well, King Curtis and Junior Walker, not to mention Mike Brecker, but let's go early." So he said, "Transcribe a King Curtis solo." So I did. I think it was from a King Curtis album called Party Time. And I did, and compared to transcribing a bebop solo, it's very easy. And then I started learning it, and then I got fascinated by the nuance in it, to a level of same fascination that I, got fascinated with bebop. And that was a turning point for me, because I saw there was, in a way, as much nuance and subtlety and skill involved in the style of King Curtis, it was a King Curtis song, as there was in jazz. It's just on a more small level, harmonically not as much, but even harmonically a lot more than I thought. And Mike suggested, he said, if you want to work, also work on your rock. And so that was good advice, but it was really because I started to love that kind of playing, and I realized there was way more to it. When I tried to play along with the record and sound like King Curtis, whoa, I don't sound like him on this note. I don't sound, and that was a turning point in my life, which ended up maybe helping me keep the gig at Saturday Night Live. Let's go fast forward 10 more years.
Right, and you can never know where that's going to lead.
You never know.
But here's the point.
But I was interested in it. That's the thing.
Right, it struck a chord with you.
It struck a chord with me very much.
Right.
King Curtis got and Junior Walker, and I had already heard Mike Brecker's rock, but Mike himself told me that was influenced and influenced by King Curtis. And Mike's another special situation. Let's just leave that alone, because that's an endless subject.
It's
but
true.
let's say Mike had an influence of King Curtis, Junior Walker, Coltrane, and Indian music at the time when he first came out, and his own original component, which was 50%. It's like ridiculous. I did get to know people like Mike Brecker when I was young. Who knows how? Random, pretty random, actually. But
that's also part of the great stuff about being in music and being open and trying to decipher a lot of styles in music, which as a woodwind multi-instrumentalist, that's the basic requirement.
Yeah.
And that's part of the great thing, that you're meeting all these people with all these different talents and influences,
right.
And it's like, it's endless. And that's part of I think, going back to what we talked at the early stages of the interview, that's the fun that maintains itself.
Right.
And what keeps you going. All right, let me just interject something. What do you do today on your own practicing? Because you've talked about how you practiced in prior years, or what things influenced you in your practicing. Today, after all these years and experiences you've had in jobs, what do you practice? What interests you in your practicing?
Okay, well, first is something I left out. I'm self-taught on piano. It started when I was very young. I started figuring out chords like this: C, E, G, A, C6, and it progressed to the point where I can, say, accompany a singer or an instrumentalist only on a ballad with nice voicing. Right. Just self-taught. First of all, I would say over the years I've maybe put in as much hours, I would just call it putzing at the piano, not formal, on my own.
Not golfing.
No. Because I realized that has definitely helped my jazz a lot. And I think anyone that wants to play jazz past the Dixieland style, which is great, by the way, nothing wrong with Dixieland swing. You have to know some piano. But I got real addicted to harmonies, and when I start, so that I do. It's these days, I've gone a little more back to the basics, and that was a lot of Bob Malik's influence on me, one of my closest friends and another, I would say, hero of mine. Back to basics like the Gillet scales and even some of Harold Bennett's old exercises, and re-examining some of the Joe Allard concepts. So a lot of that, and then I just play for fun. Something I always did, someone may have suggested it to me, or I figured it out when I was very young, was learning pretty songs, which today would be called standards or jazz ballads, and playing them in, if not 12 keys, at least 4, 5, or 7 keys. Now I still do that, and that's a lot of what I do. I must say, at the expense of practicing other things that could have made me better, like the etudes that you pointed out that address your weaknesses. I might have been a little light on that, but that's today. I'm at a different point.
Right.
Before we leave it out, I want to talk about playing in all these different styles, because it seems like if there's something that's my strong suit, it might be that area, to be doing convincing versions. I don't know. Well, you should say that, not me, but you know.
No, it's okay, because I think that is what a studio musician has to be, somewhat of a chameleon of styles. And your success I think is rooted a lot in the fact that you have this broad knowledge of styles and sounds, and you're able to implement them at will.
My way of doing it is, it's almost like an acting. It's like acting. Like I get I try to feel the emotional mood of Sanborn or King Curtis, like it happens, because when I listen to those guys, it makes my organs and my brain and body and emotions feel a certain way. So it's almost like an acting career where you can, in other words, I can't do those styles by any technical way. I don't know exactly what I'm doing with embouchure or air, but for me, if I get into that head of how they make me feel when I hear them, that's how I do it. It's like an acting role. It's almost like disguising myself. And as you know, I have a little fun in wearing disguises and doing acting bits. Yes. Yeah.
Shall we?
Oh, okay. Okay. Camera off. Yes. For example, let's say all of a sudden I have to be a French guy who is too unaware to wear a rug on his head that looks like a piece of hamburger meat. I could do this too. And, I also like languages, and I like saying words in the real language. Like, I don't say Brazil, I say Brasil, which is the way they say it. I don't say Munich, I say München. I like imitating the sounds of different languages. So I think I like mimicking comedians and actors and talk show guys, and it's not unrelated to imitating different styles.
So when it
has to come from what I'm saying is it comes more from inside and liking it a lot. There's a lot of things I can't do.
Right. So if you had to play the Pink Panther theme, this would come in handy.
I had to play it on the jingle once, which was for Owens Corning. Definitely. But also the fact that I heard it at a young age.
But I mean,
another one of my idols, Plas Johnson, in terms of playing the perfect thing on so many different styles, perfect studio jazz solo. I'm a big inspiration. But yeah, the Pink Panther, I'd have to get in that mood of the.
Well, would you put the hairpiece on first? Talk as Professor Clouseau?
No. This is a funny story, but let's get rid of the props.
Okay.
Okay. But yes, the way I play the style is kind of like it's almost like a disguise or a mood that comes from first how their music makes me feel, and then I do the style. But of course, a lot of study went into it, meaning trying different things out at home. And I did it in the old days of LPs a lot, or cassettes, where I'd stop the tape and, no, I didn't sound like that guy. How much is he bending, or how hard is he attacking? Or I did do a lot of that. Right. But again, because I was interested in it, not because I thought it would help my career, honestly.
Right. No,
honestly.
Well, that's the truth. But I think that's an essential point. That it has to come from a deeper sense, not just an economical sense. And your study of the multiple woodwinds, in other words, beyond the clarinet, then the saxophone, then the flute, in the order that you studied, was from a sense of saying, hey, I like doing this. I want to sound better. I love what these guys sound like. I want to sound like that. Not, hey, I want to do that because I think that's going to open up a lot of work for me necessarily. That may be a secondary
It's true, because by the time I was doing that, I didn't even know what the work was. That I didn't really even know what a jingle date was, and that you doubled, and I didn't really know that when I first fell in love with. Yeah, right. I'm kind of innocent. In my case, the fact that I didn't come from a musical family and my parents didn't know what famous teachers were. In fact, I'll just tell you a story. This could help some people maybe who didn't come with all the musical background and prodigy. When I graduated high school, I started thinking I might want to, maybe I should get more serious about music. So I actually, in the summer before I went down to the Old Manhattan School of Music, and somehow I got in to see the dean on some off day, and I said, well, I'm thinking maybe I'd like to come here and become a music student and study the clarinet. It's very timid. And the guy goes, okay, well, who are you studying with currently? I hadn't really heard the word studying with. I only knew taking lessons. I'm just telling you, that's how green I was. And so I timidly said to the guy, oh, my teacher now is Sammy Maslin in Brooklyn. And now Sammy Maslin is another story, but he was basically a club date guy, and he booked some low-level gigs in the Catskills. That's all. And the dean he almost went like, I said, well, I'm currently taking lessons with Sammy Maslin. You could tell it's a fake show business name.
Right.
And the dean almost went like, it was almost like that. And he didn't even hear me play her. And he said like, well, you know what I think is, if you're interested, I think you should find a good teacher in Manhattan and take it from there. Yeah. That was, so, the point is that in my case, because I came from it more from liking it than being set up for it.
Right.
I think in my one case, or a few other, it worked for me because it came more from liking it and not having the pressure to be that good. Or my parents never said practice more. When I got into it, my mother used to say, stop already, go out, the other kids are playing ball, why don't you go out and play, you know?
Right.
So in my case, it was good. I don't recommend it necessarily, but
right.
Like as I said before, I think each case is different.
Did you ever consider just focusing on one of the instruments after you had already been playing all these instruments? Did you ever say, you know, I wish I could just do this one instrument and this one style? Did you ever get to that point in thinking that, or was that not?
I never really got to that point because I like them all for different things. I did start much more on tenor than alto, and gravitated more, I think, by the time I was in my mid-30s, let's say, being known as more of an alto guy than a tenor guy. But I did a lot of gigs on tenor with, even after that. But I really loved them all. So no, I never thought of that like Eddie Daniels or Hubert Laws, just
right.
going into one. I think it's a great idea for some people, but not for me.
Right. I mean, and the other part is that people may not know, and if my memory serves me correct, when I first met you, you were pretty much solely a tenor player, and I heard about you through other colleagues telling about this great young tenor player from Brooklyn who was playing, I think, at the Gilbert's. Was it the Gilbert's Hotel with Barry Levitt?
Yes.
It was. Okay, so I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But and you also, at some point, I think...
Well, that had, like, the house band there happened to be jazz guys, including Billy Mintz, Cameron Brown,
oh, wow.
bass player.
Wow.
Barry Levitt, who was a jazz-oriented pianist.
Right. Again, recommendations for youngsters as far as practicing. Your situation seems to me rather unique, and your talent, your love for music, your passion have resulted in this wonderful career and wonderful level of music making that you bring to the table. But for younger players, you would hope they'd have all of what you have talked about and what you've demonstrated.
Well, everyone's different. There are some guys that go into it more from a business point of view. They like it, but they're not passionate about it like my friends. George Young invented a word which I love called tunatics, and that's what he calls the guys that are mostly music maniacs, which means almost all day all they do is either listen or talk about music or sit at the piano or practice or try reads. I'm sort of like that, and some people think it's sad because my life isn't a little broader. Not that I don't have other interests, I certainly do. But for other people, that may not be right. You know, sometimes definitely enriching life experience, enrich your playing. But I do think if you don't love it from the inside, which means you would want to do it even if you didn't make money from it.
Right.
If you don't have some of that, it's a big negative. You might even be doomed. Yeah. I'm not sure, but I do think you have to have some of that. Yeah. And I do think it was more prevalent in our day and the generation before us than it is now, a little bit.
Yeah. And yet it's interesting that today, certainly the schools offer so much more opportunities for learning music and for playing in ensembles and for studying than we had, and certainly that a generation or two generations before us even could have imagined. Most of those guys didn't even go to a college or anything. And yet the nature of the industry, the nature of our society has changed, and the economy has changed so much that where we think things should have improved so much more, maybe it hasn't because of that. It's sort of interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Again, everyone is different. What I might think is good. Certainly, if you're gonna, Well, here's the thing. I think more important than, you say how to practice. There's something called, when you hear music, or let's call it when you hear someone playing, even an inner part, there's something called the thing behind the playing, which is sort of I believe it's like the inner person's spirit coming through. And that part can't be exactly faked or learned, which is related to another topic that personally I think the hardest double is the saxophone, which is not what most people would say, and I'd say particularly the alto saxophone. I think what I mean is it's rarer for me to hear, even in jazz, someone that sounds stunningly great on the alto than it is to hear really accomplished clarinet and flute players. I think it's the hardest double because it's the least codified, and in learning to play the sax, there's more of an X factor. It's like kind of a knack that can't be taught. Glenn Johnson, who's I think was a near genius, said, "How do you study the sax? You become the greatest musician you can, and study the other instruments, and then study music as much as you can, which includes classical score reading, piano, listening to Heifetz, listening to Brahms symphonies, and listening to Benny Goodman, bring that all into how you figure out a concept for the saxophone." And I kind of agree with that. It's less codified.
Yeah, it's interesting. By the way, Glenn Johnston, who's no longer with us, was one of the original great Hollywood saxophonists who also developed this phenomenal ability as a mouthpiece refacer and had tremendous insight into the acoustics of the woodwind instruments and specifically the saxophone.
Quite a brilliant guy philosophically. And if anyone wants to hear him, one thing that's rather remarkable is the black and white movie called Rhapsody in Blue. In the opening credits, it's Glenn who plays the clarinet cadenza in Rhapsody in Blue. In the movie itself, it's performed by the version of the Whiteman Band that's in that movie. In the opening, and it's one of the most unique and best versions I ever heard of that cadenza. You never heard it, right?
I don't remember it, to be honest with you.
Well, we'll get to hear it one day together.
We will.
It's unique. Glenn was, by the way, you may not know, Glenn hung out with Stravinsky, used to come to his pad because Glenn innovated in hi-fi and recording at like a home thing in the 30s or 40s. He had speakers and stuff. And he also hung out with Charlie Chaplin, who I guess he knew from the studios.
Right. Wow.
So he's a very unique guy.
Yeah. Let's talk about, wrapping this up, some of the specific recordings that you would recommend other doublers might listen to as great references for certain styles. I mean, some of the recordings that you would say are your your 10 island requests. What would you take with you as a doubler?
Okay, that's a good question because, and that's a beautiful part of music. One's tastes and preferences generally change as one gets older. So what I'd recommend now would be different than what might have attracted me at the beginning, except some things remain the same. I think one great thing to hear is any of those great Hollywood alto players that did the solos in the black and white films. And one of the epitomes of that is Taxi Driver, which I think it was Greg Herbert or someone turned me on to that in the 70s. Now, through you and others, it's become common. But there's all sorts of other solos in movies that no one knows. You hear them on TV, but they're soft. And one of the greatest at that was Les Robinson, who I met at the end of my life.
Right.
And if just an obscure reference for those of you that are interested in it, there's a LP only existing of a soundtrack called Baby Doll.
Yes. No, it's actually CD now too.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
I got it.
And anyway, it's chock full of the kind of alto playing I'm talking about, which was done by Les Robinson.
Who, and we should just say Les
Ted
Robinson
Nash.
was the
esteemed lead alto player of the famous Artie Shaw band during the period of Begin to Begin. And he just had that silky. Some people have gone as far as saying that's what legit alto should sound like, but with a different style to phrasing of the music. But tone-wise, I kind of agree. They sound more beautiful and violin-like and human voice-like than almost all the classical saxophonists, in my opinion. And that's a different era, different equipment. But that's one thing that people I highly recommend. Another thing is we know about the jazz guys. It would almost be redundant, and I listened to that more than anything until I was a little older. But there are what I call stylists, and if I ran a music department, or if I ever give clinics, which I don't much, I would talk about the great stylists. Leave the jazz guys alone for now. There's too much jazz. Jazz is not the whole be-all and end-all of music or of saxophone. I used to think it was. And some of those stylists are, believe it or not, Boots Randolph, certainly Plas Johnson, Michael Brecker and his different ways of playing. Let's see who else that gets left out. There's a whole bunch of them, but Plas would be a great example. Let's think of alto. George Young, stylist, also plays great jazz and bebop, but a stylist who can everything. Those kind of guys should be sought out.
And you mentioned earlier in the interview Ronnie Lang, who is quintessential.
One of the, definitely. That's one of the most beautiful things ever recorded on the alto, in my opinion. What's it called? Opening title to Taxi Driver, or main theme from Taxi Driver.
Right, that recording.
Bernard Herrmann composer. It's really something.
Right.
That's a level of artistry that you're getting into like now. Heifetz or Nadian or Milstein, or you're getting into that level.
Right.
Although it's slow.
Just to summarize a little bit, you've referenced a few recordings such as Baby Doll and Taxi Driver.
That's for
from
one style,
movie recordings, movie soundtracks can give a great insight into that for young doublers and how to interpret that style of music that you might encounter. What about, and you've mentioned some of the rock influences.
Definitely. Anything by Junior Walker, just to get the most rawest, basic, it's just incredible. See, at a certain point I converted, and those guys, like Junior Walker, would get to me as much as Sonny Rollins, Train, Stan Getz, Cannonball, and I really couldn't believe it that they got to me to that level later. So I think anything of Tom Scott with the LA Express, the solos with Joni Mitchell, the now famous Dan Higgins, Catch Me If You Can.
Right.
That's something in our time, more recent. There's beautiful Gary Foster things in terms of that beautiful alto playing the lighter kind of sound.
Yeah.
Let's see. But everyone, Ben Webster, forget about his jazz, even his style of playing a ballad.
And that album, the Ballads album.
Right.
Fantastic.
Right. Coleman Hawkins with strings, the one that has Julius Baker in the background.
Right.
There's all sorts of things. There's a guy named Babe Russin who played in, one of the things he played in is Paul Weston Dance Band, but you talk about a smooth tenor tone. These are all guys that I kind of curious, and I'd find out about them, or randomly hear it on the radio or when I was younger, and then they would say that's the Paul Weston Orchestra, and I would find out who the tenor player was. Pete Chrisley, separate from his jazz, as a stylist, incredible. I would recommend anything by Bob Malek, jazz or especially funk. He's got a unique soulfulness that is well worth being exposed to. Very unique. I'm trying to think more. The guy that Coltrane apprenticed with, Johnny.
Earl Bostic.
Earl Bostic, guys like that.
Right, R&B.
Guys like George, certainly Johnny Hodges. Of course, David Sanborn, who I do rate as one of the greatest players of all time in his idiom. He himself does not consider himself a jazz player. He came from the blues, he came from Paul Butterfield, but he found a new way to make the saxophone fit in pop. Now he plays great jazz in his way, but a genius. And I'll just say this, one thing that makes Sanborn stand out from his hundreds and hundreds of imitators is the precision of his intonation. Not to mention that the style is really coming within him. It's not something he heard and picked up. And Lou Marini's a little like that too. He moved to New York already having that bluesy feeling mixed with the bebop.
Yeah.
It came from within him. He's an important guy. Another inspiration, I should mention him. Yes. I didn't mention all my colleagues that inspired me, but it would definitely be Lou, Jerry Dodgen, George Young, Harvey Estrin, Walt Levinsky, Ronnie Cuber. Oh my God, for feeling. He's a baritonist, if you don't know. Those are a lot of my influences. And then the older guys who are probably no longer with us, like Phil Bodner and Romeo Penque and
Sid
Cooper, good flutist. Bernie Kaufman, way under the radar. If you can find anything that Bernie Kaufman played alto solos on, this is for older style. Great, one of the best flute doublers in his day, which would be his prime, probably was the 50s. Those are all guys. But let's try to go back to the stylist. That's what I think is missing in school education. Too much emphasis on jazz and big bands, maybe, and not enough on these stylist guys. I'm trying to think of more, but no, at the moment.
Well, and all of these stylists that you're referring to are saxophone oriented, but as a doubler, now we also dealing with flute and clarinet minimally. We're not dealing with the double reeds today, but just the flute and the clarinet. Who are the people that have stood out for you as influences on either hearing them live or on recordings? Flute. Well, let's do flute first, and then clarinet.
Well, that's more like it's the same people that hopefully would influence pure flutists who just play flute and pure clarinet. But okay, Harold Wright, my first teacher Goldstein, I'd put him up there with the greats.
All right, these are the clarinets then. You go into the clarinets now. Okay. So the clarinets, Harold Wright.
Sorry, clarinet. Certainly Ralph McLean. These days, John Manassi, who's a friend of mine. The guys in the Boston Symphony that you recommend.
Bill Hudgens.
Even the old French guy.
Gaston Hamelin?
Well, Hamelin, but before that.
Bonnard?
No,
before Hamelin?
Yeah. We talked, but anyway, all those guys, I don't know. Marcellus, I put way up there for musicianship. Just the classic people. There's a lot of people, there's so many people today I couldn't. Certainly for spunk, Stanley Drucker. Okay, that's enough. This stuff is all available. This isn't a secret. The stylists of saxophone, that's kind of more of a secret.
Well, and I think what comes through when we were talking about this, that on the clarinet and the flute, the majority of the requirements for doublers centers around a more classical approach to the instrument. Right. Of course, there is the jazz, swing jazz clarinet thing that's there, and occasionally the Latin jazz flute aspect that's important for doublers as well.
There's a whole style of flute playing that isn't jazz or bebop that was done by Fajardo and Richard Egues, who played with Orchestra Aragon in Cuba. That's a whole other idiom, which not many doublers could do, but you should be exposed to it, because you don't play jazz on G minor C7. You play some other kind of melodic rhythmic stuff. Okay, flute, the normal suspects. My teacher, Harold Bennett, Julius Baker, maybe my favorite, or maybe my favorite, Fernand Dufresne.
Ron Paul,
people today, Ron Paul, yes, for the spirit of the music and a different tone than after Galway. There's a different kind of flute tone, which is great and now become the norm in orchestras, but should be exposed to the pre-Galway concept of tone. All those guys.
Can you just, in a general form, talk about the equipment that you have found to be most effective on saxophones, clarinet, and flute? Do you use the same setups for all the music? Do you change setups, meaning do you change mouthpieces, reeds, even horns, depending on the music? How do you approach the different requirements that you've encountered in your career with regard to the equipment that you use?
Well, Ed, that's a very important question, and I'm glad you brought that up.
And
it's a very deep question.
Good, and I want to get really down to the essentials of it.
So equipment, it's a real hotbed subject. If looking back, if I had spent less time researching and trying different horns and mouthpieces, I think it would have been better, because it can be extremely diversionary and confusing. However, since I'm interested in authenticness, I am someone that sometimes uses different equipment for different styles. Often, though, however, you're on a gig and you just can't. So yes, you can do it all on your basic Meyer alto mouthpiece if you have it in your head strong enough. I once had an experience where I got called last minute show for a jingle to do a solo. Somehow this guy knew me as a rock guy, maybe because I played in Saturday Night Live at the time. And by accident, I only showed up with the Selmer C Star because I think I had been practicing on it that moment. And there I was having to play in a style something like Sanborn with my Selmer C Star.
Rubber.
Right. I had a read on it. The shocking thing was, and this is only because it was microphone. I was in a booth with a microphone. I did the best I could, and I was shocked at how it sounded. Now, that's only because I was in a booth, and they can make me as loud as I want, and they had the reverb, or maybe they added highs to it, I'm not sure. But it shows it's more up here than in here.
Right.
Okay, but that's recording, that's different.
Right.
Yes, okay,
That's a great story, actually.
It is. It taught me a lot.
So
there's equipment. Yes, yeah. I even brought some stuff up. We won't demonstrate it today.
Well, we can do that after.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
I do think for real rock and roll, you would be better off getting comfortable with a more open mouthpiece and soft reed. I do think metal is better on tenor for rock than rubber, although there are exceptions. And it isn't about that metal is brighter or louder. It isn't that. Sometimes metal is darker. What I've learned is it's the way the note starts. It's the amount of emotional that the note has in metal. It somehow is more communicative. I don't think it's about bright or dark or baffle. It's the metal. It's the start of the note speaks different. Mm-hmm. And I've even noticed King Curtis, who's great albums with the metal Berg Larsen versus the rubber Berg Larsen. It gets to me more on the metal. So I do have now a rock setup for tenor, which is now a Berg Larsen 120/0, something I never thought I would play. But it does. It's loud and it's got that sort of vintage rock sound. I do have a mouthpiece like Paul Desmond, which for very special things is wonderful, and that's another guy I got into later and tried to emulate Paul Desmond. That's a style that's not so well known and done, but I could tell you from experience playing with singers and improvising little solos, singers love the Paul Desmond sound much more than I ever thought. So that's a tip. Get into Paul Desmond and being able to imitate that kind of lighter, airy sound, which is the antithesis of Cannonball or Johnny Hodges. So I have a setup like that. Now, what I've gone a little further because I realize you can't just change mouthpieces. So I sometimes have these mouthpieces on other necks so that I can just plop the whole thing on.
Right.
And in addition to that, certain mouthpieces go better with certain necks. Now, that assumes you have the luxury to have extra necks, which I happen to have. I think that's the best way to change mouthpieces, also changing the neck. But that's pretty complicated and esoteric. But I feel in imitating styles, you can get 90% on a general mouthpiece. But if you want to go and try to approach 98%, you do need equipment somewhat like the person you're imitating.
Right.
And yes, for clarinet, we left out the whole Benny Goodman thing for clarinet. And that ties into my origins because my father had Benny Goodman, and I heard it. That's probably the one thing I had in my ear as a baby. Right. But yes, a more open mouthpiece for clarinet with a softer reed when you play a saxophone approach to clarinet, which is kind of what jazz clarinet is, and a shorter barrel for playing jazz than regular studio or show playing, because you have to play looser, almost blowing it like a saxophone. And if you don't have a short barrel, to be in tune, you're going to be pinching, which will eliminate a lot of the jazz tone. So that's, if you don't know that, that's something that's big, I think.
Yeah.
So I do have it varies, but like a typical thing would be, even a Van Doren could do it, something that's more open than a 5RB lyre.
Like a B45.
B45 you can do it on, yes.
Right.
Just something generic, something a little more esoteric. When I started, the club date mouthpiece for being loud was an HS double star, which by today is considered wildly bright and open and harsh, but that Walt Levinsky played that for his Benny Goodman. Yeah.
Wow. And that's one of the
So yes,
sounds.
I do think you need at least two setups for clarinet, one for louder big band jazz or even to sound, and one for the more classical approach. However, with a classical mouthpiece with the right mindset and knowledge of the style with a shorter barrel, that's key, can give you a very good jazz sound.
Right.
Eddie Daniels is the epitome of that.
Right.
The epitome. He uses equipment that's more classical than a lot of classical guys.
Right.
And you know what I mean by that. If you don't know what I mean by that, you'll figure it out one day. But so equipment, yeah. On alto, I've used either a Dukoff metal or at the current moment an old Brillhart metal level air when I really want to play rock. Like I play in a blues band sometimes at Lou Marini and those guys, kind of a bar band. We do it for fun. And I found that the metal, it's not about being brighter or louder. There's some emotional quality to the way the notes bite. Like it just comes out more that way. Right. And when you use a Meyer, it sounds a little bit like the thing of a jazz guy trying to play rock. That's another thing I didn't talk about. In pop music, knowing when not to use jazz feeling or licks, that's a big thing. That is a big subject, to play more pure in the idiom and etc. Okay.
Right. Well, that also comes from studying and listening.
Yeah.
And let's talk about equipment for flute, which may not, because we're not dealing with the reed, the mouthpiece.
Right. Well, flute is really evolving now, and I know almost all the studio doublers in LA play what I call modern, but it really started in the 70s with Cooper head joints. I finally broke out of my old rigid thinking, which is I do think a doubler should own a modern scale flute with a modern head joint. I think overall you do need one of those. For personal pleasure at home, I have a Louis Lott and old Powell's, which I do use an old Powell as my main flute. It was slightly retuned, and I'm not using the original head joint, but it is a Powell head joint that has a little quicker response and louder than the original head joint. That's a whole, could be a whole separate interview, which I wouldn't mind giving, but it's vast.
But
my
I think
advice would be, don't get too consumed with trying things, because it's too costly and it takes time away from maybe developing other skills. But to never screw around with equipment, to just be one of these guys, no, I'm just going to stick with, that's wrong in today's world. That's also wrong.
Right. So you have to find a happy medium, and usually it happens as you get older. You start realizing, or you have a kid, you have a family to supply for, and you don't have as much time, so you start saying, okay, I'm not going to buy that extra mouthpiece or the extra another saxophone. That's, I've got to be a little more careful. But getting into equipment does give you greater insight into the players who you've listened to, and understanding how that sound could have evolved. even
it
with,
makes
even
you
with the
it makes you
talent.
play even different notes in your improvising because you're hearing a different mood. So you tend, if you're a good player with a good ear, you will actually play different notes, and the notes start and shape up differently, which affects everything. Now, I also have to say there are some great guys who do it all on one mouthpiece, and maybe that's better. For me, I like the fun of researching and having a few different setups. Oh, certainly for saxophone, for classical tenor and alto, if you ever get a gig playing any parts with a symphony or ballet, you definitely need a different mouthpiece. And I've been in situations where someone came in with like their normal all-around mouthpiece to play bolero, and it was, to those of you who don't know, you can never be soft enough in certain things. The joke is that before you even come in with your first entrance on Romeo and Juliet, the conductor looks at you and goes like this. Before you even play a note.
The napalm.
Yeah, the napalm.
The napalm.
So yeah, I have to mention that. Now that's one thing I think the all-around guys who do their whole career on one mouthpiece, they generally do have something different, more towards a Selmer C star, closer and more manageable to play really soft.
Right. Well, we've had a great time today, Lawrence, and you've given us a lot of information and a lot of insight into your career, but also advice, I think, for others going forward. And that's the whole point of this interview series that I'm attempting to start. And I'm so glad you were the first person that we had here for this, because your career speaks for itself, and your knowledge and your passion and also your concern for music comes through, I think. I don't know if you realize that how much you closed your eyes in talking about this stuff, because that's that's something that happens. You know, when you see musicians playing and they're closing their eyes and playing, we sometimes have come to expect that from improvisers, but you were doing that as well throughout this interview, and I think that's going to carry forward to our listeners. So I want to thank you, my friend. It's been a gas.
Okay, thanks, Ed.
And we hope to see you next time.
With some help. That's all we can hope for.
And it will, I'm sure, and we hope you'll come back not only to revisit Lawrence's interview, but also our next interviewee will be the great legendary alto player Charles McPherson. So we thank you for listening and hope to see you again.